Well, welcome. Today we're with Josh Weikert, author, grandmaster, beer judge, and certified cicerone. I'm Doug Piper, and I'm the host of the Gourmet Brewing Channel, and I'm located in Greenville, South Carolina, in the USA. It's starting to get warm down here in the South, as I think today we hit maybe 92 and 95 tomorrow, so we're getting kind of an early summer here, but it's been a beautiful spring, maybe up until this week when it's getting hot. Thank you so much for spending time with Josh and I today, because you're at a place where we strive to make your day more delicious, one sip at a time. Now, I want to bring Josh up on screen here, but we're not going to ask him to say anything just yet. But I'm looking for you to say some things in the chat. I would first of all like to know, is the audio and the video okay from where you are? Because I can't always tell. So, Edward, maybe you could pop in the chat and let me know how the audio and the video is, or anybody else that can beat him to it. 5 by 5. Great. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. As we're getting into this, the other thing is please share where you're viewing from. Thank you, Martin. It's always good to kind of know where everybody is. And we can't applaud for Josh. He can't hear it. But do me a favor, just really thank Josh for doing this, taking the time. It's not unusual for us to go 2 hours. He's already had to endure me for 30 minutes. So if we go on to this, it'll be, and he showed up in our big brew day that we had earlier, which was a lot of fun for those of you that caught that. Gosh, we had Ray Daniels. We had a crowd of folks. Dick Cantwell. It was a lot of fun. So check that out. You can still catch the replay here in Crowdcast. Please vote in the polls down there. A couple of new polls. Some of you have endured when I was running for AHA governing committee, and thank you for those of you that trusted me enough to give me your vote. I'm on the committee. We've had our first meeting. And one of the things I promised the governing committee is I would ask my audience about AHA. So I'm interested in your thoughts. And if you're not an AHA member and the question doesn't help you, a lot of you have my email address, so just email me. Put it in the chat. I would love to know how we can work together to make AHA even better than what it is. Josh Weikert is a Grandmaster Judge and Certified Cicerone. He's a writer and columnist for the Craft Beer and Brewing. He also is a featured writer in Beer Connoisseur, Brew Your Own, and Growler. He's a regular speaker on beer and brewing topics at conferences, homebrew club meetings, backyard barbecues, whether he's invited or not. Now, he wrote that one, so I want to hear more about those. His day job is a professor of politics. Dr. Weikert, I presume. If you're a full-time viewer, these are monthly free events, and we do them with subject matter experts like Josh. This is our 80th free major event. You can find them all here in the Crowdcast link. And this is provided by folks like Luke Pernoto, who helps me with the copywriting, Whit Lanning, who helps me with the glassware you'll see some of today. And most important are our crowdfunders through Patreon. This is a completely crowdfunded event. There are no sponsors besides those who crowdfund us. But they're all recorded, and the replay is immediately available afterwards. And this is just a community-funded channel. And so if you would like to be part of the solution to keep us on the air and encourage us and help us get more guests, if you click on that green button there, you can learn all the different ways that you can support us. And our Patreon supporters get the MP3 files as well as other behind-the-scenes video. We would not be here without you, so I'm incredibly appreciative to those of you that support. And some, even if you're not interested in doing it through Patreon, there's always the option when you sign up for an event to buy me a coffee or buy me a beer there. So Appreciate that. Supporters get the audio files, behind the scenes, brewery tours, and so consider joining our team of supporters. Now, back onto logistics. There is a follow button in the upper right-hand corner. No, I think actually it's this one. Sorry. It's exactly the opposite when I look in the screen there. That follow button gives you notifications. We all know how unreliable email is. Well, this gives you a notification of when I go live. That's all you get. You won't get spam. So click on that if you don't mind, and then you'll get notifications. Refreshing your browser solves most technical issues. You can reduce the resolution with the little gear symbol in the bottom right-hand corner. Submit your questions. Now, down here, Josh is going to answer your questions in the second half of this event. So that's the most popular part of our event. So, and I'd love to see somebody stump the professor here. So let's get in some great lagering questions well, they don't have to be limited to lagering, but I would love to see your questions there. Also, when you register, always click the auto registration. That saves you time and it helps our events. So do that. For anybody's interested in virtual speaking or virtual tastings or live events, I do those also. So if you've got one coming up or even your homebrew club wants to get involved, I'm happy to do that. Now, we've got some upcoming events. Something really cool came in today, and I want to share you a video of it. Check this guy out. We have Vinny Chirluzzo himself sent me these beers. These are World Cup Saison. Well, this one's not. That's a Pilsner. But he might have done that to fill up the box so it'd be an even 12. But anyway, so Vinny and I are going to be discussing the Pilsner. So a question I've got for you, and I've actually put it there in the polls, that I'd love to know, do you want it as a live event? Do you think, there's enough interest? Because I know not everybody can get this Saison. I can't buy it. So I know not everybody's interested. But I am going to do it at least as an interview. So you let me know what you think. I'm not sure it lends itself to a live event, but I want to know what you think. We're looking to do an event on farmhouse ales and maybe even do a Zoom brew like we did last Saturday, where, it'll be a long broadcast, but we have people popping in and out to talk about farmhouse beers and the brew. I'm working on a wood event, and I also want to do one on Czech lagers, but I'm having trouble finding a subject matter expert on that, particularly one who speaks English. So if you know of somebody, please email me, put it in the chat, somehow let me know of somebody you think that would be a good Czech lager speaker. And the last thing, or at least just about the last thing, wanted to let everybody know we're going to do a Zoom hangout afterwards, just kind of an after party. Maybe Josh will join us in there, but we can hang out in there and talk just a little bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the event. So just join us, pop in, pop out. So let me bring on Josh. All right. And I didn't realize I had not changed my screen there, so my apologies. Although I think I'd rather look at those beers than look at me too. So Josh, and don't forget to unmute yourself. Welcome, and I'm really glad to have you today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Doug.
So what are you drinking? You got started early on me. I haven't opened mine yet.
I did. This is a local brewery to me from Conshohocken Brewing Company, which is outside Philadelphia, which is where I'm at. And it's a Schwarzbier of theirs that I found buried in the back of my fridge. And I can confirm, for if anybody from Conshohocken is watching, that a 9.5-month-old, give or take, can of your Schwarzbier is holding up great. So keep it up.
Wow. Schwarzbier is one of my favorites.
Definitely.
And we should have included that in this, I would think that qualifies as a fringe lager.
It's on the fringe.
Well, so what is, so I think, a Rauchbier is, and the one I'm going to be drinking tonight is actually a Marzen.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what makes a Rauch beer kind of out there and different? And, if you were to, somebody ask you, hey, guy gave me a Rauch beer, what in the heck is that?
If you wanted to give somebody a quick rundown on, what makes a Rauch beer a Rauch beer, you'd have to give them a little bit of history, because it's one of these things that we only had to define as we approach the modern era. Because once upon a time, everything was a Rauch beer. To kiln malt used to be done over open flames, and so smoke got into the malt, and kind of every beer was a Rauch beer. It was only after the invention of hot air kilning that all of a sudden the smoke flavor goes away, and the resulting beers don't smell like smoke anymore. But a few breweries kept the traditional methods alive, traditionally, especially out of Bamberg. So, that's what Rauch beer is. It's simply, it's a traditional, amber lager. You can say it's basically a Märzen or an Oktoberfest that is simply brewed with traditional smoked malts, usually beechwood, though it doesn't exclusively have to be. But that smoke flavor does really throw people off at first.
So Doppelbock, kind of a weird name. How would you describe a Doppelbock to somebody that had no idea? They said, hey, I love great traditional German lagers, but what the heck is a Doppelbock?
I'd probably try and hook them on the traditional notion of it as a beer that the monks in Germany drank during Lent, right? Because they were abstaining from food, so they needed a rich, hearty beer to keep them going, through Lent. And so that's where Doppelbock comes from. It's simply a Bock brewed to a stronger, strength overall. But the flavors you get out of it really is like drinking just like liquid bread, sometimes sort of dipped in like Nutella, because I love that in Germany, Nutella or chocolate, right? It's got sort of a really rich, savory flavor to it. But at the same time, all of these still have underlying them that sort of clean background flavor that we expect out of lagers. There's not a ton of esterification or phenols or anything else. And even even the alcohols tend to be, much more muted than you might see in some other styles.
And then the last one, which I've actually had very few of, is an Eisbock. Now that really is a fringe lager, I think. So how would you describe an Eisbock? And again, I've not had many, so I'm interested in the profile.
Well, Eisbock might actually be illegal. I've had people hit me with that one. That actually producing a homemade Eisbock is actually violating a law around distillation. Because the way Eisbocks work is essentially what happens is you brew a Doppelbock, you freeze it or come close to freezing it, you form ice in it. And because the ice basically pulls water out of the Doppelbock, you concentrate what's left. And so you end up with a lager that is much more intense in flavor, usually a lot richer in body. It has the same basic flavor profile of the Doppelbock, but it's the dial turned up to 11, right? And the risk you run with Eisbock is that, we can talk about making them later if anybody's curious about that, but the risk you run is that you're concentrating all the flavors, which means that if you've screwed up even a little bit, you're going to taste it. You need to really have your lager production process dialed in, have it very, very, very clean before even attempting an Eisbock, because otherwise every fault you come across is going to be, increased by 15, 20, 25%.
Oh, wow. So that might be the most unforgiving lager that there is.
It probably is. For me, ironically, it sort of lands on both ends of the spectrum, right? So on the one hand, you have Helles, which is like, 3.5%, 4%, and nothing but just like straight Pils malt, maybe a little bit of floral, right? And then, on the other extreme, you have, Eisbock, and neither one allows for any mistakes, which is, one of the beautiful things about lagers. Because look, I love all beer styles. I'm not a stylist. I will drink anything pretty much anyone puts in front of me without judgment or discrimination. But I will say that I'm always impressed by lagers more often than ales, because there isn't as much to hide behind. The delta between like sort of the world's best IPA and maybe not the world's worst IPA, but like that like 80-20 delta, the interquartile range there. Not to get too geeky, it's not that wide. Great, really, really, really good IPA versus just okay IPA tastes kind of the same. The same thing is just not true with lagers, and the more interesting and involved the lagers get, the more likely we are to notice those differences.
I know I always liked what Tobias Zolo, Weinstefaner's head brewmaster, said in an earlier live stream. He said, Doug, I think a lager is a brewery's business card. Isn't that interesting?
I think that's the best way to put it. The nearest I can come to being in comparison is, again, I live in the Philadelphia area. And anytime a new pizza or sub shop opens, you show up and you order a cheesesteak with fried onions. Because if they can't get that right, then there's no hope for anything else. So I would go, look, he's in Weinstefan, that's fine. But I'm in Philadelphia. I'm simply going to say that lager is like a cheesesteak of a brewery.
Well, as we get into that then, so let's talk about how these styles relate to Pilsners. Now, when you said that, I thought, Pilsners, why not Helles, or why not Marzens, or what made you say how these styles relate to Pilsners?
When I try to explain lagers to people, and I'm sure lots of people in the chat and watching already know this, but, lagers are a relatively recent invention. And they, the most famous lager in the world comes out of the town of Pilsen in Czechia, in Bohemia. And, we get this beer that's very light and crisp and clean, and it's really popular, right? Everybody likes it. And as a result, this style sweeps the world. And as I talk to folks, especially people who don't know much about sort of how brewing evolved and how beer styles evolved, one of the ways to sort of like track the development of lots of beer styles is find a popular beer, something like the Pilsner out of Pilsen, and sort of just watch it travel and watch how the local conditions change it up, right? So it goes over the mountains into Munich, but because, the water, is harder there, higher temporary hardness, you have to sort of change how you brew it. And so as a result, you get Oktoberfest in Märzen. But then it travels elsewhere and you start seeing other changes. The differences about these fringe lagers is that they share the profile of being relatively clean beers like the Pilsner is, but they almost always have other things going for them, like other things that are adding to that flavor. It's not just sort of naked light malt and a little bit of hops. And in other words, we're not really showing off, what the lager yeast can do. Instead, we're applying the lager yeast into flavor profiles where you don't want the fermentation character to be adding much to it. So as we start drifting away from Pilsner, we opened the show talking about Schwarzbier. Schwarzbier is basically just sort of like, is just Pilsner plus some roast. But that's sort of when we start departing from, that sort of traditional Pilsner lager kind of profile. And as we talk about things like, Baltic Porter and Eisbock and Doppelbock and Rauchbier, we start seeing all kinds of sort of methods and processes that start working this over. And in many cases, these local conditions as well. Because if you're in Helsinki and you're brewing beer, good luck getting the temperature up to like 68 degrees, right? And, odds are you're going to be throwing a lot of like really rich malts in there to get that flavor rolling. And so you start seeing local conditions bearing out on that. The Eisbock, I freely admit, I have absolutely no idea who made the first Eisbock, but I can almost guarantee you it was an accident because it is really just a wonderful, wonderful beer, but I can't imagine why anyone did it on purpose.
No, would be living dangerously, wouldn't it?
Or maybe somebody mentioned fractional distillation. I actually use that term, but I don't think that's actually technically what it is. Just because I only bring that up because I got in trouble for saying it was fractional distillation once, and somebody lectured me on, like, no, that's definitely not right. And again, this may be the first and certainly not the last time I'm going to say this tonight. I am not a scientist. So like if I say things that are just flat out wrong, please jump in and correct me. I love nothing more than learning, things I don't know. Because it isn't. That's why I don't even like it when people introduce me on these things as like Dr. Weikert. It's because like no, that invites a lot of questions I don't want. If you want to talk the difference between like proportional representation electoral systems and first past the post systems and mixed member proportional systems, I'll do that all day. But if there's anything else around metallurgy or biology or chemistry, I am happy to defer to others and just sort of like lean on their expertise compared to my experience.
Well, are you ready to talk about our Rauchbier?
I just need to polish this off. That's why I started with something light. I knew I was going to have to get it down quick.
Well, I think that is a fascinating beer, and we'll play it when we're ready. But I had the privilege of spending almost an hour and a half with the owner and head brewer of the beer we're holding right here. So he's going to introduce it when we're ready to do the pour. And so versus what we normally do, and I do a live pour, I have a recorded live pour that I did with him as he describes his amazing beer. But we won't do that quite yet. I'd really like you to introduce the topic, if you don't mind, Josh.
Not at all. Rauchbier, as you think about what to expect when you put it into a glass, Rauchbier, you should be expecting, just what you would expect from a Märzen. All right, you expecting some caramel flavor. No particular fermentation characteristics coming out of it. A fairly well-rounded flavor. It doesn't have any sort of rough spots on the palate. But what you're also going to get, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, is an aroma of something between, like a whiff of cigar smoke and a whole sausage in the glass, kind of depending on which Rauch beer we're talking about. Because the presentation can vary quite a lot, from very, very mild smoke all the way to up to very intense smoke. And just to preview this for anyone who is planning on brewing these, what determines the intensity of that smoke is not really the percentage of smoked malt used. What it is the amount of smoke in the malt you're using. So I started out brewing Rauch beers and brewed them with 40% smoked malt and then 50 and then 60, trying to get more intensity out of it. And I learned an important lesson, which is that I got all the way up to 97% Rauch malt, and it really didn't change the intensity of the smoke profile at all. What did change was when I switched up which smoke malt I was using, different forms of Rauch malts, which is smoked with beechwood, and trying out things like cherrywood smoke malt, oakwood smoke malt, and what have you. So, yeah.
So were you smoking essentially already finished malt? You weren't actually malting it.
I wasn't doing this at all. I was simply buying. But I do know people. I can hook you up with people who do smoke their own malts. And we did something fantastic with my homebrew club, Stony Creek Homebrewers. I hope some of you are watching, or at least maybe later. We did a great thing. John Putnam and Michael Burry did a thing called the Smoke Chronicles, where they simply smoked took a basic, 2-row pale malt and smoked it using all different kinds of malts. Or excuse me, all different kinds of woods, and brewed out beers on these, and let us taste them side by side with like plum wood and cherry wood and apple wood and all these different woods. It was utterly fascinating, but I have nowhere near the patience for that.
So what was the conclusion on the woods? I think that's a fascinating area.
First of all, that there was a much larger degree of difference than we would have expected. I mean, because like some of the woods you expect, like you expect like mesquite or something like really exotic to do something really wild. But even the difference between like, cherry wood and plum wood was like night and day. And it wasn't just the type of the smoke character. It was all these secondary and tertiary flavors and characteristics that we were getting out of it. And things that we couldn't attribute, or things that if we didn't know any better, we probably would have attributed to hops, to fermentation character from the yeast. But instead, we're just these, it was just coming out of the malt because all the beers were produced in identical grists and identical processes. So it was just the wood. So it really goes to show you how much variability you get really varying any brewing ingredient. It's the reason that we have basically 4 ingredients and we get these like tens of thousands of, variations that are all distinct.
Well, that was the interesting part about talking to Matthias. He was saying that they primarily use beechwood. And I was asking him, is there a reason for that? I mean, you just like the flavor. And he just said, well, the largest forest, a beechwood forest in Germany is right here near Bamberg. So I think a lot of it is proximity.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. And it's one of the things I love about brewing beer and brewing history is how much of it is just because that's what was available locally and the conditions. And I just love being able to show that we have this, niche product that varies so much, and yet it doesn't really. It's people all over the world finding different routes to produce a drinkable product based on what's happening in their neighborhood. And in a lot of cases, just throwing in whatever's there. I mean, that Saison from Russian River there, the people who know about the, sort of the origins of Saison, it was a harvest time beer where they needed to, get beer to the farm hands. And so they just sort of threw in the spices and the grains that they had on hand, and voila, you've got Saison. So, yeah. And of course, that miracle in the the Seine River Valley there in Belgium, where if you open stuff to the open air, you get the best beer in the world. So, like, congratulations.
And that's such a fascinating area. I spent the day there with Frank Bone, and it was a lot of fun, going through all those details with him. Well, as we get back to this, I guess one of the things that surprised me talking about different kinds of smoke, I was about to tell Matthias that I thought, beechwood was kind of an optimal wood. And then out of left field, he just said, well, we have another one that we do with oak, which I've found in smoking meats is not very appealing, or at least the oak that I have found. So I don't use it for meats or anything else, but he has a beer that they do with oak that's apparently quite good.
Well, actually, I think they have two. Because I think they have an oak. I know they have the oak smoked Helles, and I think they have an oak smoked Doppelbock as well. So,
The
and
Doppelbock is what he mentioned.
wonderful. When I've used oak smoked in a variety of things, because when you make Growler, which is the basically a Polish smoked wheat beer, which does also sometimes have some pretty wild flavors built into it as well. But we'll talk about that some other day. But with Growler, like oak smoked malt is the majority of the grist. And so I played around with oak smoked malt in a variety of other applications, and it tends to be a little softer on the palate. Like if there's someone who doesn't like Rauch beers, I always sort of nudge them towards an oak smoked beer to see if they like that. Very often it's Schlenkerl is oak smoked Helles. But, yeah.
Interestingly enough, a Gradzicki was what won the best of show down in Brazil when I judged there earlier in the year, which shocked me, but it was very well done. Personally, I thought the smoke was a little too much, but I was overridden by the rest of the best of show judges, so that's okay. Well, why don't we listen to what Matthias had to say so I can get this thing opened and we could do it. So what we're going to switch to, and this was recorded earlier this morning, it's about, I think, 2.5 minutes long. I do a live pour with Matthias, the owner and brewer here at Schlenkler, and I think I pronounced that poorly. He's helped me several times to say it right. So we're going to hear what he has to say about it, and it's really neat. So hang on, and please type there in the chat if the audio is okay. Here we go.
So the classic Schlenkerla Märzen smoked beer is relatively dark in color, has about 55, 60 color units. When you hold it against the light, you will see that it's actually quite reddish in color. So it's similar to an old Nuremberg beer style called the red beer. When you open it and you dare to smell at the bottle opening, you will already notice quite considerable the smoky smell in it, accompanied by the carbonation, of course. When you pour, you will see that the foam is a little bit darker than you would expect it from normal lager beers. That's due to the fact that the beer itself is, of course, darker. And interestingly enough, most dark beers you have these days are made with roast malt, whereas the color in the smoked beer comes from the smoking process. And in the pour, you see it beautifully in the color, the reddish color from the Märzen, and the foam a little bit darker. And now you should notice the smokiness in the air already to a certain degree. You're doing this quite well. When you're looking for a job, we need tappers here at the tavern, so you can come over anytime.
I like that plan. So, I will do that. So I was going to switch over.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to kind of talk about the beer. That, of course, is the label. But we have some beautiful color.
Right. Reddish
and that's
brown.
Quite dark for a Märzen.
That comes from smoking the malt. You also see that in the foam. That has also a little bit of that brownish kind of element to it. And as I said earlier, today most dark beers are made with roasted malt. So this is malt, ready-made malt, which is in addition roasted in big roast mills at, I think, 300 degrees Celsius. This is done. And this roasting process has only been around for 150 years or so. So before that time, the color of the beer came entirely from the actual kilning process. Now, the higher the temperature in the kilning process, the darker the beer. So a modern Pilsner lager type beer would be kilned at anywhere 60, 70, maybe 80 degrees Celsius. That way it stays relatively pale. The classic Märzen from Schlenkerla, or the classic smoke malt from Schlenkerla, the final temperature in the kiln is way above 100 degrees Celsius. Not way above, but it's above 100 degrees Celsius, around 110 or so. And that makes for the dark color.
And so it immediately reminds me of a kind of a malty bacon.
Right. Liquid bacon, liquid ham, some people call it.
Yeah. But it is not an oppressive smoke. And there's a lot of acrid smokes that are out there. And this is far more of a barbecue kind of smoke, something very pleasant. And I can even smell the malt through the smoke, which surprises me.
In German, that actually rhymes even. Some people call it Schinken zum Trinken, which means a ham to drink.
A ham to drink? Well,
Schinken zum Trinken.
All right. He was so much fun. I got a real download on Bamberg and the history of the brewery and his 1,000-year-old cellars. It's a fun interview, and I'm going to put the whole thing in for our Patreon supporters because it was really a neat event. So that was just one clip from it. So I thought it was fantastic. This is actually the first time I've had the beer, and so I really was surprised. I haven't had a ton of Rauch beers, but most have, the ones I like the best, just have kind of a touch of smoke characteristic. But I found this really interesting that there seemed to be as much malt aroma as there was smoke, and it was nicely balanced and gave it that kind of barbecue or bacony kind of characteristic. But of course, not nearly as heavy. So I just thought it was great. Ham to drink.
It's one of the things that surprises people the most when they try like a really, really good Rauch beer like Steinkerl is, which is that, especially when you go back, harken back to the ancient days of craft brewing, like in the late 90s and early aughts. There were a lot of smoked, well, I shouldn't say a lot of smoked beers. There were smoked beers on the market, but you were really rolling the dice with what you were going to get because it ran the gamut from these super high quality smoke lagers out of places like Steinkerl over to breweries I will not name, but are now out of business that, we're using like liquid smoke extracts and peated smoked malts and things like that. And that's not the kind of smoke we're talking about here. We're not talking about like a phenolic cigarette ash smoke or a peat bog smoke or like you had a like Lagavulin or a Scotch. It's smoke the way meat and cheeses take on smoke. By the way, here's a fun thing you can do if you're looking for a quick and easy way to get smoked flavored cheeses. Take about 4 ounces of smoked malt, chuck it in your cheese drawer because you're storing it there, just like a little bag of it, and leave it in proximity to your cheese. Your cheese will take on that smell. That trick also works with hops, by the way. If you really want interesting flavors in your cheeses, just store anything in that drawer that you brew with. It will taste like whatever it is. I don't know what causes that, but I learned it the hard way, or the good way, I guess.
That's fascinating. Well,
I'd cast
actually,
it in my drawer one day.
I asked Matthias, I said, did you have any recipes? Because I'm really fascinated about using this with barbecue. And he said what he likes to do is make sauces with it and gives it a nice smoky characteristic. So I was actually thinking about like basting it or marinating it in it.
Sure.
But he was saying the sauce, which probably actually sounds like a much better idea.
Well, that could be a handy cheat for somebody who can't smoke their own meats, by the way. Make yourself a good smoked barbecue sauce using something like, especially as you get into like the Eisbock, which is what I'm drinking. I'm drinking the basically the heavy version of the Steinkerl Marts. And you can whip yourself up a barbecue sauce with that in it and cheat it.
The other thing I thought was interesting is he was talking about the color. So I'm going to switch over here to the camera here. Give you a little idea of what that color is. I mean, look how dark that is. I mean, he's got some nice ruby highlights, but he said all the color actually comes from the smoking process itself, which I just found fascinating because it just doesn't seem like you could get that much color, but and then, so we were talking about it, kind of exploring the topic a little further. And he was saying that's what the difference is between his smoked beers and most of all the rest of them. To get the color, people add dark malts, which adds some roast. This has no roasty characteristics at all. It's more like a really dark caramel kind of flavor with a smokiness, distinct smokiness. It's not subtle.
One of the fun facts I like to share with people who don't know that much about beer is to point out that all beer is red. If you concentrate, the biological, I'm going to say melanin. I think that's right. That in grain, it's a red tinted melanin. It only looks gold because it's very thinned out in lighter beers. But if you just if you keep adding things, if you keep adding grain to it, it will get darker and darker and darker until you get darker beer, even if you never add any roast. Whereas with the Rauch beers, what happens is that from the smoking, among the many compounds in the smoke are things like CO2 that actually enhance that color and really bring out sort of that reddish tint.
So Joseph mentions cool smoke. Now you sound like you've experimented with some things. Have you ever tried cool smoke?
Oh, no. Or rather, I've never done it myself. Again, I am a big believer. I don't know if Denny's on the call tonight. Denny and I share this philosophy that if you can cut steps out of your brewing, you should. And not owning a commercial brewery, I get away with a lot. There's a lot of skills I don't need to know. I will say I've done things though, like cold steeping roasted malts and coffee. But now, in the actual process of smoking, I'm very much an amateur. Although, as I said, I love using the various products. And so yeah, I haven't cold smoked it. I've cold smoked meats, but never malts.
So my wife was asking me what I was going to talk about tonight, and she loves beers, but she doesn't like to get into the details quite like I do. And she said, smoked beer, that does not sound very good. So what would you say, Josh, to somebody like my wife that says, wow, that just doesn't sound very good, as we kind of wrap up smoked beers? What would you tell them?
I would ask that person if they've ever had like a smoked Gouda that they've liked. I'd ask them if they've had smoked salmon or smoked meats, and smoke is a sort of really essential flavor to humans. Like we it's something we recognize very much deep down in our palates, and we like it. And to the extent that we have to talk people into smoked beers, it's either because they've been exposed to smoke flavors that they don't like, because smoke is an aggressive flavor, not managed well. It gets out of hand, much like fire itself, right? And so, but I would encourage people to think about occasions where they taste a smoky flavor and like it. And when Martin's absolutely right. Rauch beer is a fantastic pairing for food. If you want to make a Rauch beer convert, give them like any good burger or like a nice potato roll and give them a Rauch beer with it, and you will have a convert for life. It's such an obvious natural pairing. But I would say that it all comes down to quality. And the nice part about living when we do in the craft beer timeline is that we get lots and lots of great smoked beers. It's what it reminds me of, actually, just real quick, Doug. It's a little bit like when I have to talk people into sour beers. I'm like, well, that sounds awful. And I'm like, well, do you like lemonade? And they're like, oh yeah, I like lemonade. Okay, lemonade is aggressively sour. Like, think of it like that. Sometimes it's a question of association and terminology.
I'm actually glad you said that, because that's exactly where I was going. I really had never had a good sour beer until I went to Belgium. And so when I was sitting down with Frank Bone, I kept saying sour. And Frank started shaking his head, and he asked me the question. He said, now, Doug, do you consider a Chardonnay sour? No, not particularly. He said, do you consider champagne sour? No. He said, mine's not sour either, my goose. He said, it's no different. Quit using the word sour. And he was right. I loved what he produced. But I think going back to quality, I would say if somebody wants to understand smoked beers, like anything, they're good ones and they're bad ones. You might want to start with one of these if you want to really understand a smoked beer. And I'm not endorsing it. It's just that it's that good.
I also want to actually, while I have the opportunity, since you brought it up, Matthias and the whole team at Schlenkerla, I was writing a piece for Craft Beer and Brewing a couple of issues back. And, one of the things I love about the beer world and writing about beer and brewing is that, brewers tend to be very open with their information because they understand that where they brew it and how they brew it, it matters just as much as like what they brew. So there's very little that is, sort of held back as like a trade secret. But, when I wanted to write a piece about Rauchbier, I simply emailed my friends at Spring Curla, and they gave it all up. Like there's no secrets at all. So it's just wonderful to see.
Well, I will have to say I find that true in the U.S. I don't find that is true with the brewers in Europe. They're a little more cagey over there.
Look, that may be the case. It may be more prevalent. All I know is that I am in regular correspondence with lots of. Maybe it's my last name, and they're German brewers, and I tend to write to them in German where I can. Maybe I just
or it's me.
Radar.
They're kind of like, no, we ain't telling him. You'll put it on a live stream.
Just very personal.
All right. Well, that's fantastic. Well, I'm glad we had a chance to go through this. And as I said, that was a fantastic discussion with the brewer. So let's switch gears. So we're continuing to talk about, we call them fringe lagers, but what I'm calling is flavorful because they really are versus a regular lager. I guess you could say a Pilsner, German Pils is certainly flavorful. But these are flavors in a different way. These are malts like turned up on steroids, or smoke in this case. But the next one we're going to talk about has no smoke in it, but it's really got some malt flavors, doesn't it?
Are we going to the Doppelbock? Is that what's coming next?
Please.
Excellent. All right. So you shall. Well, maybe you don't have it in front of you. I hope you do. The old Eyinger Celebrator Doppelbock. As I mentioned, Doppelbock doesn't have an especially romantic history. There's not a whole lot to it. And that's true, by the way, of a lot of sort of like old-fashioned beer styles, sort of classic beer styles, is that they don't have, often these great stories. But what they produce is really remarkable. And Doppelbock is simply Bock, which is itself just a strong lager. And Doppelbock is simply a stronger version of a strong lager. And what comes from it is, this really, really pretty, I'm lit from all the wrong directions here, but this really gorgeous sort of like, purple garnet colored beer. They're usually brilliantly clear because, again, they're lagered, so they have time to sit and settle. And what comes out of it flavor wise is some of the purest expressions of malt and what malt can be that you will ever get. When it comes to Doppelbock, I can't speak for every brewer in the world, but for me, my Doppelbock is almost 100% Munich malt, 9 or 10 Lovibond Munich malt. And what that gives you in these concentrations are flavors of just, bread crust and pit fruit, and you'll get raisins and black currant, and not much else. Like there's almost no hops character to this at all, and doesn't especially need it. And when you drink it, what you will find is that you get flavors that are not complex as much as they are deep. You get a lot of impressions of the same kind of flavor. And as I sip this, you taste that plum and fig and black currant, again, is the flavor that always jumps to mind. Now, we do need to be careful, being on this side of the Atlantic, to not read too much into the flavors we get. If you've never had the opportunity to taste these beers fresh, you're missing out. Find a way to get over there. Transportation can cause problems in the flavors that we do get out of these beers, and oxidation changes the character, and so they can come across as more jammy and more dark fruit forward, and that could simply be a function of age and oxidation. But what you do always get is a very rich breadiness out of them, and there's a ton of melanoid character out of this. The finish likewise should be pretty smooth. You should not have like any sort of like scraping or sharp sensations on the palate. They finish, at least if you do them well, relatively dry, despite being as rich as they are. And that's not a contradiction. I often have people who conflate, I talk to people, I should say, who conflate richness with sweetness. And those really aren't the same thing, especially in beer. And as alcohols increase as well, we have to keep in mind that ethanol is sort of sweet on the palate. And the challenge we run into there is how do you sort of dry it out? And the way we get around this in Doppelbock is that we ferment it down as far as we can. We clean off as many of those simple sugars as we possibly can get. And what's left behind is this very rich, very malt-forward beer. Yeah, that is pretty. A nice ruby red. Oh, fresh beers can be surprising. I still remember the first time, I know it's not what we're talking about today, Joe, but sorry, can I call you Joe? Sorry, I see Joseph and assume we can
Go
abbreviate.
for it.
Uh,
I've been called a lot worse.
no, I was talking to Joe in the chat, Doug. But to Joseph Hertz in the chat, yeah, fresh beers can be surprising. I still remember the first time I went to Britain and tasted like real British bitter or English bitter, like fresh off the cask. And it was like nothing like I had ever experienced, having drank a bunch of Fullers that had been sitting in basements for who knows how long, which is not a ding on Fullers, by the way. One of my favorite beers was we were at, I forget the restaurant now. It's in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Great time to visit if you ever get the chance. But they on their bottle list, they had Fuller's London Pride, and this was before it was sold like everywhere. And I was like, wow, fantastic. Thank you, Joe. And I'm like, oh, fantastic. Fuller's London Pride. I haven't had that in years. And I ordered it, and they brought up a bottle that, so help me God, they blew the dust off of it like before I opened it. It was like I had ordered like a 1942, you know, Chateau who knows what out of France. It was like, and that's not good for beer, gang, for those who don't know. And I popped this thing open, and it was a really intense experience, but it was absolutely nothing like the sort of like grassy, hops forward English bitters that I had in the bars. So drinking sort of aged, older Doppelbock versus fresher Doppelbock is an interesting experience. And it should be noted that from a stylistic, from a definitional standpoint in the style, there's no particular reason it has to be aged. It just has to be lagered. And lager and age are not synonymous. Lagering is simply a conditioning process that lasts somewhere between 6 weeks to a couple of months. If someone tells you, oh, we need to lager this beer, therefore you can't drink it for 6 months to a year, that's simply not the case. And fresh lager is really a revelation the first time you get the chance to have it.
So Martin points out something really important that we really didn't touch on, and that is their light and dark versions of Doppelbocks.
Very much so.
Can you talk to that a little bit?
Sure. Especially for these sort of locally defined or brewery defined, house beers. And this is true for the Belgian styles as well as it is for German lagers. You did have a significant amount of variation. We classified them and clumped them together now, in groups as best we can because we sort of feel like we have to. But it is the case that a Doppelbock from one brewery or monastery to the next would be very different. And there are pale Doppelbocks and there are dark Doppelbocks. And a lot of that was the kilning process, the particular production facility, whatever it was. Some places would kiln their malts to a lighter, Lovibond level. If you were kilning your malts only to like 5 or 6 Lovibond, whereas the place down the road was brewing them to 18 or 19 Lovibond, you could brew the exact same recipe to the same gravity, but you get very different colors. And what we find in Doppelbock is that in very pale Doppelbocks, you still get that intense malt flavor, but it's the lighter malt flavors. So you'll get more in the bread and cracker and biscuit. Whereas in the darker Doppelbocks, what you find is you get more of the plum and the currant and the chocolate and the toffee and those darker flavors.
Well, I have to say that's one of my favorite beers, and I just love the complexity of it. I think it's so. How hard a beer is this to brew? We were talking about this earlier. Lagers in general are not the easiest beers in the world to brew because there's nowhere for all flavors to hide. Doppelbock has a bit more flavor to it. So we've talked about Rauch beers. You can get too much smoke or not enough, or you can get the wrong kind of smoke. So where can you go wrong with a Doppelbock?
Where we go wrong in beers like Doppelbock, which can be very simple in recipe formulation. I mean, they're as simple as it gets. Again, if anyone's listening and needs a recipe for Doppelbock, it's 100% Munich malts. Done. Like that's it. That's your whole recipe. You can tinker with that if you want, but you don't need to. Where the challenge comes in is that, when we look at things that cause non-lager flavors, they tend to be things that come with yeast stress. Esterification, phenol production, ester or fusel alcohols. These are all things that come from yeast that are in a more stressful environment. As the ABV goes up, so too does the degree of difficulty. So what comes into play that now, as we're producing a good Doppelbock, is that the recipe is not hard to formulate, but getting a clean product out the other end can be, simply because brewing a 6 or 7 or 8% Doppelbock might entail a greater degree of difficulty than brewing a 4 or 5% Helles. So we have to think about things like, are the yeast properly or is the wort properly oxygenated for the yeast? Because lack of oxygen stresses out the yeast, and all of a sudden they start producing things we don't want. It could be something along the lines of not making a good choice on yeast strain. If you choose a yeast strain that produces a bunch of diacetyl and can't clean it up properly, then you're going to get flavors that don't really belong here. One of the wonderful things about lagers is that they are showcases for whatever ingredients go in them, because the yeast contribution is simply to convert sugars into ethanol and ideally almost nothing else.
So,
if I can just answer Rodney's question real quick in the chat.
please.
He asked, when using 100% Munich malt, can you talk to diastolic power and get a high conversion? This was probably more of a concern in days gone by. Since I started brewing, which is, I can't believe, 15 years ago this past month. I can't believe it. I've been brewing for 15 years. That was barely a concern then, but certainly in the years since, even Munich malts at relatively high London bond levels have enough diastatic power, enough enzymatic power to convert all your starches into sugars. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it. If you are concerned, you can throw in 1 pound of American, especially American malts tend to have, greater diastatic power. You can throw in a pound of any American malt if you want, just to be on the safe side, but I wouldn't be especially concerned about it.
Well, the quick question I wanted to ask before we move on to the Zywick or to the Baltic Porter is mashing.
Mm-hmm.
To get a Doppelbock in modern times with modern malts, how do you mash one and get the kind of flavors that we're getting out of this Salvatore?
I really feel like, and to your point, Martin, 910 Lillebond is what I use for my Munich malts. So it's not dark Munich, but it's light Munich either. Anyway, I'm sorry. To go to the question, if anybody from my homebrew club is watching, they know exactly what I'm about to say, which is that every single beer I've ever made, almost, I mash at 152 degrees Fahrenheit. For one very simple reason. Number one, I like consistency. Consistency is great. Consistency makes good beer. But I also love it because I've read research on this that have held a lot of variables constant and found that 152 was actually the best temperature to create the most fermentable wort, controlling for other factors. So if you want a very fermentable wort, which we do, because we want to dry this thing out, for all the talk we hear about, 148, 149, what have you, mashing at 152 for longer was basically the formula that produced the most fermentable wort. And this was thanks to a study from some folks at Y Yeast in cooperation with, I want to say UC, I want to say Davis. I could be wrong. I think so. Yeah, I think that was Professor Bamforth who worked with them on that. So, 152. And again, extend your mash time if you're concerned about fermentability. And if you'd like, you can thicken up the mash a little bit. That'll add a little bit more fermentability to it. But 152 for about 90 minutes, and you'll be in great shape.
Can you do it with an infusion mash?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, no question. The first 7-8 years I brewed, I did nothing but simple infusion mash, batch sparge, single step. Yeah. Now, if you do a step mash, you need to be careful actually, because you might be scrubbing out mouthfeel and textural features that you actually would have wanted in your beer. So yeah, don't add steps you don't need.
So what was decoction mashing not traditional for Doppelbocks?
It was, but decoction mashing was always a way. Decoction mashing was always a way around the problem of having undermodified malts. And I'm sure somebody's going to scream at me in the chat. It's fine. It's not necessary. You can add flavors through decoction, but when you look at people that have approached this, experimentally and tried out, triangle tests of decoction mash versus not, and using things like, melanoid malt or biscuit malt or not, what the consistent finding is that decoction may add flavors, but they're neither consistent nor necessarily is it necessary that you decoct to get those flavors. So I've done decoction mashes. They're fun. I enjoy it, but I enjoy decoction mashing the same way I enjoy like Stein beers. If you've ever done that, where you drop hot rocks into wort to boil it. It's an interesting process, but if I don't have to do it, I'm not going to.
Yeah, I like the word Tobias Zolo did for Weinstefaner. He said that decoction adds a rough, that was his word, characteristic to it.
Probably because what you're doing is you're boiling husk there. And so you're pulling compounds out of that, probably tannins, although again, I'm not a scientist, but yeah. It's a
Well,
risk. And again, if the whole notion is to produce a repeatable beer, which for most of us it is, whether we're commercial brewers or home brewers, if the goal is to produce a repeatable beer, anytime you introduce extreme conditions to it, you're creating a greater variance around that single standard deviation.
well, then I think we're on to the next lager,
I'm glad I had my wife bring some
which I'm really looking forward to. So I mean, these are my favorites. So you picked out some great beers.
Although disappointed. I'm disappointed that you can get your hands on the Steinbruckhoff, because that really is my my two beer. If I need to hook someone on high quality lager, that's what I go to.
All right. Well, I tried. So I'm going to pour this, and if you don't mind speaking to it while we're doing the nice pour.
As I pour off my Baltic Porter. Baltic Porters is really one of my favorite beer styles. I'm a sucker for most German lagers. I'm a sucker for English bitter, but sort of also in that family for me. Sorry, there we go. Set the bottle down. Also in that family for me though is Baltic Porter, for one very simple reason. I love the intensity of it, and I don't have to fight to taste it, which is not the case for its very close cousin Russian Imperial Stout. So Russian Imperial Stouts are imperial beers, obviously. They are high in alcohol. They're very intensely roasty. They have acrid, burnt flavors to them, and that's desirable because you need those to offset the sweetness from that high level, of ethanol. Baltic Porter comes in a little lower in ABV. They range from 6.5 to 8.5%, let's say. Some are higher. But the best part about them is that you get very, very strong flavors of roast without it being intensely roasted and burnt. Okay. So as you look at it, you'll find it's dark brown. It ranges from sort of like very, very deep red to very dark brown. I think it could be approaching black. And the reason that language always sticks in my head is I got dinged once on submitting a Baltic Porter competition that was too dark, and I don't know what judge gave me that, but whatever. But a very, very deeply colored beer. The head, your head looks a lot whiter than mine does, actually. Interesting. I wonder what accounts for that. Could be some oxidation in my bottle. The head will tend to be sort of like, a sort of off-white to a light tan color. And what you'll get when you smell it is, again, a lot of impressions of roast without roastiness. So think Schwarzbier, but much more intensely, aromatic and flavorful. And, the best of these, smell like really, really, really expensive, high quality hot chocolate and cocoa and some really interesting, like dark roasted coffee flavors. When you taste it, you should taste a lot of those, those deep fruit flavors, the red currant and raisin and fig. But it will all be up against this backdrop of very clean drinking beer. And the alcohols will contribute there a little bit too. You'll notice a peppery and perfumey kind of flavor along with it. So now I'm going to, Okay, thank you so much for the pronunciation guide on that one, Gary. I do appreciate it. Juviets. Thank you.
Oh, really?
Because I've been saying Civic I've been going all German with it.
Yeah. Juviets. Thank you, Gary.
My Polish brother-in-law thanks you. He is
excellent. Cheers.
Na zdrowie. That's the Polish one. Na zdrowie. Zatruzie is another one. Prost.
This is the smoothest.
I was just going to say, you should be able to drink like a full liter of this. Now, you'll be taking a nap right after, but it drinks as smoothly. And this is something you'll find as a feature across all these lager styles. Even the Eisbock, which, again, if you can get your hands on it, be careful because it can be very dangerous. But it will drink very heavy, very thick, but it will still be very smooth. If you're drinking a lager and you get sort of a raspy or a rough flavor to it, someone probably did something wrong along the way, because all of these lagers, and I think this is actually a great progression through them to taste a bunch of sort of different types of it as they increase in intensity. They will all drink very easily, which probably is what attracted me to them in the first place, because I came into craft beer looking to emulate a lot of the, German lagers and English bitters, which are not the, harshest or most intense beers out there. And I sort of gravitated towards lagers because I like that feature, but then I fell in love with them because I found out that lager doesn't have to be boring. Lager very often is, intense and curious and interesting and can embody all these different flavors. And the number of arguments I have to have with people around lagers because they try to tell me that lager is boring and dull. And what they really mean by that is that the most common lagers, the most ubiquitous lagers in the world. So your mass market like Czech lagers or Pilsners or your Buds and your Millers. Yeah, by volume, most lager is kind of, dull, but by sort of like number of lager styles are as likely to be intense and interesting as ale styles are. So that's where we are.
Well, it's a little bit like foods. You could almost say you don't like a McDonald's hamburger, but that doesn't mean you're going to write off hamburgers altogether. That there are better hamburgers than McDonald's. Not that theirs are bad, but there certainly are better ones.
Well, hang on. I'm not going to make the value. That's Doug making the value judgment. I would say I'm polishing my non-beer snob credentials here. One of the beers in my little cooler here next to me with all these other, world-beating beers is Dos Equis Amber. Why? Because, it's a good beer. But yes, to that point, just like there's a place for McDonald's hamburgers in the food pantheon, there's room also for these mass market lagers. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be going out of your way to try, the world's best hamburger, whatever that is.
Yeah, I don't want to get on another whole topic, but the more I have investigated the Mexican lagers, I mean, there's some good Mexican lagers out there that are arguably industrial.
Yes.
And my wife's favorite beer is a Dos Equis Amber. So
Modelo Especial is a fantastic light lager.
Yes.
And you can see, I think I have it in here as well. I have a cold IPA in the cooler. I'm doing an article right now about cold IPA, which is not a lager, so I wasn't going to bring it up. I didn't want to make it weird, but to that point, you see a lot of the sort of the DNA from other styles in newer styles. There's really nothing new under the sun, right? And cold IPA shares a lot in common with your adjunct lagers of Europe and the U.S. and Mexico. So.
Well, as we begin to wrap up, first of all, I want to see if I can get all these on screen, because what a beautiful array of beers that we've got here. We'll take that full screen. There we go. Almost all fit. How about that? So this is our Baltic Porter. That's our Doppelbock. And this is our Rauchbier. And they're stair-stepped. But I would like to say that was planned. But it really wasn't. But as we summarize these, and I know you've said it once before, but just help kind of pull together. We called them fringe lagers when you and I were kind of crafting this, but I would call them, more highly flavorful lagers. How would you, somebody that maybe all they've had is Coors or Budweiser's, and you say, hey, I've got a lager I want to introduce you to. How would you explain the differences between these beers and kind of prepare them for what to expect?
The best analogy I could give folks is when they talk about bread. Because if I just say bread, like you might be picturing just plain square white bread, right? But then I said, imagine if I told you, okay, that was the only bread you'd ever eaten, but then I gave you a slice of wheat bread, right? Well, that'd be subtly different, okay, but still sort of in the ballpark. But now imagine I give you rye with cardamom. Okay, now that's much more intense. And then there's pumpernickel, and there's, all these, enriched breads. And before you know it, they're still talking about bread. They're still talking about that same basic product that just has, sort of grain and yeast and whatever. But now all of a sudden they're expanding their mentality and the vocabulary around them. And that is the real challenge. It's breaking people out of the bias that says that lager equals some particular flavor profile, which is defined by, Pilsner or Kel or by Budweiser. To get people out of that default assumption, once you do, you're fine. It's the easiest thing in the world to get them to try new beers after that. But people have a certain impression about lager, about bitter, about ale, about stout. And by the way, we can do a whole episode about stouts too, because the gamut you run on stouts from dry Irish stout at 3.1, 3.2% up to, the most intense stouts you can get. It's a real journey. And the important lesson I think that comes out of it is that all beer styles, like beer is too complicated to summarize in just a couple of words. So what I would say if I was going to hand someone any of these beers is I would ask them if they've had a lager and what they think about it. And I would say, okay, this is going to be like different from every other lager you've ever had, because lager just means clean. Now I would hand you this and say, does that taste clean to you? It might taste intense, it might taste different, but does it taste clean? And I think most of the time that gets people around on it.
Well, I love that summary. So for those that have to go, I know we're a little bit past the bottom of the hour, but Josh was just awesome. I couldn't wrap it up, so please thank you for your patience. We're going to switch to the questions. So if you've got to run, but you've still got a hard question for Josh, you want to stump the professor here, feel free to go ahead and click it. And if you've got to run, you'll actually get an email when Josh is answering your question. And if you don't, catch it tonight or tomorrow, when you click on it, it'll take you exactly to that point in the live stream, and you won't have to listen to me. You'll go straight to Josh answering your question. So let's move into the questions. Let's find out. Oh, by the way, everybody gets a vote. So if you don't have a question, but you have one there that you think's the most important question, everybody gets one vote and can vote up the most important question, and that's the one we'll start with. And my guess is that that's the one that Josh will spend the most time with. So we got 9 questions, Josh. That means less than an hour before there's a hard stop. And by the way, I don't know that I told you that, but it's sort of like when you give somebody $20 at the gas pump, and I mean, when 2 hours is up, it is an unceremonious end.
Fantastic. Well, I'm used to getting questions of any degree of complexity or interest, and I can encapsulate that answer as quick. I can deal with these 9 questions in 50 seconds if we needed to. I'm not going to do that, but we can.
Let's spend the most time on the most popular question. Let's see who that is. All right. So Merlinius has got our first question with 4 votes. So what good reasons are there that Kveik should not be used for brewing these strong lagers? And what other things should be done to ensure that the finished beer matches the right profile for the beer? So I think this is all about brewing with Kveik versus traditional lager yeasts.
I think, first of all, I don't think there is a good reason not to give these a shot with Kveik yeasts. I mean, give it a go, see what happens. I mean, that's always my advice to anyone asking about any process, just because the way yeast behave, especially a relatively new to us yeast like Kveik, it's going to be to some degree, greater or lesser degree, idiosyncratic. It's going to depend on your system, your recipe, your process. And so see if it works. Try and then evaluate the results and go from there. I would say that given my experience with a few of these strains, I'm not sure I would try them with these, only because to the extent that they do produce fermentation characteristics, they tend to be fermentation characteristics that sort of jump out against these backgrounds. If you get like just even a touch of pineapple against this, Eisbock, like you've got a problem. You're going to smell. It's not going to make a bad beer. It's going to make kind of a Hawaiian pizza, ham and pineapple beer, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you try to hand that to someone and say, hey, I'm trying to emulate Schlenkerla Eisbock, they're going to realize something is different. And again, that's not a ding against the yeast strain. It's really just that, there are some traditional strains that tend to work better with certain styles and some that don't. Now, very often we stumble into happy accidents where it turns out you can make a great version of this beer with this yeast strain. But even narrowing it down as far as saying a Kveik yeast strain is probably not narrowing it far enough. It would depend on which one. Because even something like, using Bohemian lager versus Munich lager yeasts are going to produce very different beers. And I would not use a Bohemian lager yeast to produce Doppelbock. I would use a Munich lager. So it's really a question of sort of finding the right tool for the job. So I would say give it a whirl and see what happens. And I would say that for those who haven't played around with Kveik yeast, definitely do it. I would also say that, for your average sort of like clean beer where you're just trying to let other things show out, like American Pale Ale or American Amber, definitely do it. I would be surprised if without some serious tinkering, you got a great result on a Doppelbock though with the Kveik yeast. I would say you'd be better off using something like a Cal Ale, like a Yeast 1056 WLP 001. If you're just looking to like make a mock lager with it, I think we already have good tools for that. I don't think we have to introduce those.
But the Rauchbier, that actually might be very good with that pineapple orange characteristic.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
I mean,
In terms of making a tasty beer, I am 100% on board. But if
yeah.
you were trying to make it, if you were trying to brew a classic Rauch beer to win a medal in competition, that's not the yeast I would go.
No, they throw that out in a hurry. Great question. Let's move on to the next one. Our second most popular question Reed has. Most recipes recommend Polish, I'll pronounce this, Lublin.
Lublin.
Lublin hops.
Lublin.
Say it again.
Lublin.
Woobling. Okay.
Happen to know that one?
No, I don't. So most recipes recommend Polish woobling hops. Most homebrewers cannot get them for their brew. Can you recommend a good substitute for a USA homebrewer?
Yeah. I mean, Lublin. Don't blame me. It's their language. If I'm not mistaken, is a fairly traditional sort of Satzer family hop. So really anything you get, like Satz, Styrian Goldings, anything in that family would be just fine. You can probably even get away with some of your like Hallertau variants even on that. So yeah, anything in that sort of classic sort of noble hop. Actually, now that we mention it, something like Perle might be my go-to. But Satz can be problematic simply because some Satz hops don't really present as well as they should. You need to use a lot of them to get that flavor. So if you're looking to sort of, not have a ton of green matter in your beer, yeah, I'd go with something like Styrian Goldings.
All right, great question. And I saw that Martin was asking about the correct pronunciation for Rauch. And actually, I went through that, and Matthias was very patient and tried his best to train me in how it's pronounced. And I said, it sounds like you're saying Ralph. And he said, no. He said, it's a real challenge in German. You've got to get this guttural kind of growl. So
Ralph.
Yeah. So, I mean, he kind of had a growl to his.
Yeah.
So I'll send that to you, Martin, because he pronounced it presumably correct, and I don't think I ever did a good job with it.
Gary just threw ROWK in the chat. That's not nearly enough letters. It's like SC. I would say it's like SCHGKHA. Rauchbier.
Rauch. Well, yeah, he had this kind
of actually, we're focusing on the CH part. The R, you have to sort of swallow it back too. It's not Rauch beer. It's well.
I like Gary's answer. He said more beer.
More beer, yeah. If you drink enough, you'll pronounce it right, whether you want to or not.
All right. Our next most popular question is from Joseph. And Joseph asked, can you advise on how to provide enough smoke, but not too much smoke for a specific beer? Perhaps for a 5-gallon batch. Is it by experience?
To an extent, it is. There may be something unique to your process and your recipes where the amount of malt matters. I would recommend, I recommend this for every beer, and I'm stealing this from someone. I think it might be Sean O'Sullivan at 21st Amendment. If so, thank you, Sean. But it might not be. But if it is Sean, hi, thank you. Take a handful of every malt you get and throw it in your mouth and chew on it. And whatever you taste, that's what's going to taste like in the finished beer. That's just a good rule of thumb. As I mentioned earlier in the program, it's really not about the percentage of smoked malt. Like you'll find a good percentage in that, but that's mostly about other things you're introducing to balance the flavors. It could be anywhere from 20% to 100%, and no one can tell you for sure because it depends on which malt you're using. And very often that might even depend on which maltster, which variety, what wood was used in the smoke. So we have to be very careful with that. I would say with any smoked beer, you can safely use, and almost with any smoked malt, you can use safely up to 40 or 50%, and it won't be too much. It might be on the higher end, but it won't be too intense. Anything below 20%, I would say there's almost no point in doing it. The flavor you're going to get out of it is going to be relatively minimal unless it's a very aggressively smoked malt. So again, I mentioned mesquite earlier. Mesquite smoked malts are very intense. But yeah.
So how about the not enough side of it? You said you can't get too much, and you said less than 20% is not quite enough.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say I wouldn't bother using smoked malt unless I was going to use at least 25%.
Okay. Okay. Well, I like that rule of thumb. Then you start there, and if that doesn't work, then obviously you either back up or add more.
Well, ordinarily, I'm a believer in starting low and building because you might be surprised at how much you get. You might hit your saturation point quickly enough. With smoke beers, it's the one thing that I make an exception for, where I say go high and sort of back off, because you want to make sure you get that smoke character in the beer. And the difference between a 50% versus 75% smoked malt Rauch beer is not going to be much difference in terms of like being too much, but you might land too much on the too little side. So I would say actually for Rauch beers, if nothing else, start high and work your way back, or just go 100% Rauch malt to start.
To that end, is there any way to add a little smoke, either during fermentation or, if you didn't quite get enough? You had any experience with tuning it a little bit?
Theoretically, yes. But it would have to be a beer you would be willing to tolerate some acidity in. So if you were looking to make just hypothetically, like a smoked stout, where you could handle some sort of lactic flavor in it, I would say theoretically you could cold steep some smoked malt. Well, actually, this would work. Since we're talking cold side of the process, you could cold steep smoked malt, boil it off to sanitize it, dump that into your beer, and you probably would get some smoke character out of that. So you could do some cold side adjustment, but it would be a challenge. It's much easier. It's much easier just to go higher in the mash. And again, for the most part, smoked malts are not special malts, and they're not kilned more. They're just kilned over an open flame instead of in the hot air kiln. So the reason 100% Rauch malt works in my strong Rauch beer is because it would work in a strong Märzen. It's essentially the same, it's the same malt. It just happened to preserves that smoke character.
Well, and Gary raises an interesting point, and Matthias actually brought this up. He said it takes 3 pints to really appreciate a Rauch beer. Now, I said, that sounds like a brewery owner speaking. And he said, well, maybe it is.
Spoken like somebody sells Rauch beer for a living.
Yeah, but he said really to fully appreciate it. And we all know that it hits you different in the first pint than it does the second pint.
Yeah. And in fact, I would encourage people to drink, something like Schlenkerla Märzen, and then drink, almost anything else, and compare the flavor, because you will notice big differences, even in beers really well. One of my favorite tricks is to give someone like a 3-4 ounces of a smoke beer, and then give them something like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, and have them just, their minds are blown, because like this is a beer they know well. They've drank 1,000 pints of it, but it tastes completely different. And then have them double back over to the Schlenkerla, and you will taste totally different things again. So I'm not hostile to the notion of like palate evolution, but I will say that as somebody who is often forced to judge beers in like 2-ounce increments, you should still be able to taste the smoke. It might be different. But.
Well, I like what Ray Daniels said about it. He said your palate's kind of interesting. He said once it picks up one flavor, it says, hey, I've got that one. Now I'm looking for something else.
Yes.
And I think that's very true. But what Matthias was pointing out is that once you've got that smoke and you're kind of acclimated to it, now you are looking for other flavors, like the malt characteristics. Maybe it's the hop characteristics. And he'd love you to say you 3 pints rather than just 1 or 2.
And look, I think you should definitely buy 3 or 4 pints of it.
But not drive.
No, well, you don't have to. Bamberg's a small town.
Well, that's true. That's true. All right, Joseph, great question. Let's see. Todd has our next most popular question. Can you speak to the yeast pitch rates and your favorite lager strains that you've had success with?
I can. I would say this, and I might upset some people here. I hope I don't. Yeast pitch rate calculators are not your friend. I'm pretty sure yeast pitch rate calculators were invented by people who sell yeast. And I say that because if you go back to John Palmer's How to Brew, when he talks about sort of like cells per degree of Plato per whatever the other volume is, or the other measure is, what you find is that your average, White Labs Vial or YE Smack Pack or SAF, SAF Ale or SAF Lager sachet of yeast, what you find is that even at 5 gallons, even at 1100 gravity, to start, you're within the range. It may not be ideal. In other words, you might be able to low end of that range of, cells per degree Plato, but you're not outside of it. And in my entire brewing career, which again, I feel really old, I now know is 15 years long. In my brewing career, I've never pitched more than basically 1 pack of yeast into any 4 or 5 gallon batch. And they've all been great. That sounded arrogant. What I meant was none of them are showing obvious signs of under pitching. I tend to think that yeast, pitch rate calculators tend to be excessively risk averse. Like they describe brewing up like 3 and 4 and 5x pitches because it's a lager, because it's high ABV. I'm telling you that I'm trying to think of the strongest lager I make outside of the Eisbock, in which I cheat, but it's probably my Baltic Porter, which comes in at about 9.5%. I brew that with a single pitch of yeast. There's nothing magical about it. Yeast are very, very hardy. They're good at fermenting anything up to and including about 10% ABV. So long as you manage them well and control their temperature and give them plenty of oxygen and everything else, you don't need a giant yeast pitch to make this work. So what I would say is that, start with a smaller amount and use good brewing practice, and you'll generally get clean lagers. If you find that you're producing a lot of esters and a lot of, diacetyl or VDK or whatever the precursors are for DMS, if you find that you're producing a lot of that, then maybe you need a little more, but start smaller and see what you get. In terms of which strain, if I want something that is more, if I want something that's, I'm trying to think of the right term. I'm going to struggle here. I'll blame the beer. If I want something I know is going to be well fermented, I go with a Munich lager yeast, a German lager yeast, a Weihenstephaner yeast, simply because they tend to break down more just at the molecular level. And again, I don't understand the mechanism behind this, but I have really smart people who tell me that that's true. If I want something that is going to be, produced, more in the realm of sort of rounder mouthfeel, rounder flavors, I go more to the Czech yeast. So I gotta go south toward the Alps. So.
Yeah, Philippe Jansen's actually a fermentus, answered the rest of the questions. For those that watched that program, we had a great discussion there, but he only got through 6 of the 25 questions that I think we had. So he followed up, but he pointed out that 3470 was one of the most robust yeasts out there.
And about it, you can push the temperature on it really high. Even if you can't produce a lager because you don't have a fridge, anything up to 67, 68F, it's still really clean.
Well, and he was also pointing out that while the question was asked about, how many dead yeasts are contained in a sachet, and he was saying, it depends on the yeast, but it's significant. I mean, it could be 15, 20, even 25%. But he said the difference is the minute those yeasts start multiplying, that just becomes insignificant, is what he said. So yeah. I think if you want a really robust yeast, 3470 is hard to go wrong with, and that's what he was saying.
Yeah, agreed.
Great question. We'll move to our next one. Wow, I don't know that I can pronounce this because most. I don't know that I can pronounce that. Cosmo. I'm going to shorten it. Talk about Polish Ublins, hops. Is that what you said? Ublin, Lubins?
Yeah, Wublin. Yeah.
Wublin. Okay. Polish Wublin. What do you think of the Poland smoked wheat beer Grodziskie?
Yeah, Gratzer. I can't pronounce whatever the Polish name for that beer is. Piwo, but yeah, Gratzer. Gratzer is one of the classic styles. It's one of the beer styles that got me super excited about beer. In other words, it's one of the few beers where someone handed me one and I took a sip and my face changed and I was like, "What is this?" It was really remarkable. The first one I ever had, because you get some really remarkable flavors out of it, not just from the smoke, but also from the more rustic grains that go into it, because you can make it with wheat and rye. You get like sort of citrusy flavors out of it. So, I mean, obviously it's a classic hop pairing, the sort of like, that smoked Polish, wheat beer with that Satzer hops. I would say though, that's a good one though, to do some experimentation with, and maybe even things like sort of like classic American hops, like cluster or something like that, where you get some of those more rustic flavors or some of your wild hops. Is it Neo Mexicanus? I think is the one I'm thinking of. Basically because Grautzers can accommodate a fair amount of citrus flavor. So things like American Goldings or American Hallertau might be interesting choices there, which might just be easier to find. But anytime we can sort of like merge these flavors together and get good products, I'm really a big fan of. Kind of like when we take things like the New Zealand and Australian hops and use them in styles that call for more citrus and lime and what have you.
Well, and what is the correct pronunciation? Grodziskie is what I heard. So what? Maybe somebody can correct us there. But yeah, it is an amazing beer. As I said, that won Best of Show down in Brazil when I did the competition there, and it was fantastic.
Great stuff. Yeah, Martin, to your point on Neo Mexicanus being peachy, I agree. But it also has a pepper, like a white pepper flavor to it as well, which is just a lot of fun.
Now wait a minute. That's a new one on me, Martin, and maybe you know what it is. Neo Mexicanus?
It's basically
what the heck is that?
It's basically a wild hop. It is to hops what like chives are to onions, where we cultivated a bunch of different hops and made them like a specialized agricultural microclimate product. But hops just grow wild in nature too, and Neo Mexicanus is one of those. There have been some studies done on the flavor profiles and the oil composition of it. But, yeah,
wow. Well, we can get off in some tangents. All right, next question. Edward asks, what is the temperature recommendation for lagering? Is it 34F? And for how long? I've done a couple of lagers, and I think I need to do it longer, maybe longer than 1 or 2 months. What do you think?
I don't think you ever need to do it more than 2 months. So let's start there. If you do, there's probably something else on the front end of that process that could be addressed that would clean it up a lot better. And it could be yeast choice, it could be water chemistry, it could be a lot of things. Good lager is good lager sort of the day after it hits the package. And like it might not be the best it can be, but if you've ever had, a number of sort of like raw green lagers, like you'll taste the flavors you expect to get out of them at the back end. So I would say that when I'm lagering a beer, if it's a high alcohol, if it's something like the Baltic Porter here, which you can't tell because they don't look the same from my lighting angle, but if it's something like the Baltic Porter, yeah, I would give it more time simply because as ABV goes up, a little more time helps round off the rough edges and lets the flavors come together a little bit. So I might give that a full 6 or 8 weeks. For something lighter, though, something like a classic Rauchbier that's only like maybe 4.1, 4.2%, you don't need to lager for that long. What you want to make sure you do is control your fermentation temperatures initially and keep them at that 48, 49, 50 F, basically around 10 C or lower for the first couple of days. Once you get out to about 5, 6, 7 days, you can let that rise almost at will. And none of us have enough fridge space unless you're a commercial brewer, and you probably don't either, actually, think about it. I would tend to, just keep it sort of in the fridge for a few days, then pull it out and just let it sit at room temperature. Because all you're trying, well, not all, but most of what you're trying to guard against are those initial off flavors and precursors that are produced early in fermentation during the rise to high Kreuzen. Once you get outside of that stage, after like 6, 7 days, there's not much risk associated with higher temperatures. And in fact, they can be a real benefit because what they can do is blow off a lot of things we don't want, like some of those sulfurous compounds and maybe some of the other volatiles that we don't want in that finished product. So I would say pay more attention to your temperatures during early lager fermentation. And when it comes to actually aging the product, conditioning in the bottle there at cold temperatures, keep it at near freezing for 2 or 3 weeks and then taste it and see.
Yeah, Philippe Janssens was saying the same thing. He said, bring it down slowly, because he said if you bring it down too fast, your yeast will tend to settle out too quick. Now, he said if you want to recover yeast, that's a good way to do it. But he said if you bring it down slowly, that it will tend to produce a better beer.
It may. I tend to think that's one of those lessons that's probably more applicable for a professional brewer than a home brewer. So I can't really speak to that. But I know they pay more attention to that than we do, simply because we don't have to. We tend to not be, cropping yeast and reusing and washing and everything else.
All right, our next question, and we're down to just 5 questions. At the end of the questions, we will jump into a Zoom call for those that have time and want to continue. So Peter has our next most popular question. I've been making lagers and pseudo lagers, and I'm having issues with clarity. Despite the lagering, my Truller Pils recommended that home brewers filter in the magazine. And it's the magazine that you write for. Is there something you would do for lagers to improve clarity?
I would say that, I've done filtering and I don't mind doing it. It's not a regular practice for me simply because I've gone to single vessel brewing, fermentation, conditioning, and serving using a floating dip tube. Basically, all of my beers go into one keg. It's fantastic. I love it. I highly recommend it. Having said that, the best thing when it comes to clarification is gelatin. Maybe your mileage may vary, but for me, it doesn't matter how young the beer is. It doesn't matter really how I've treated it. If I hit it with 2 rounds of gelatin, just 1 pint, 2 cycles of it into about 4 or 5 gallons of beer, I get a clear product. I would say don't be too diligent about removing your hot break and cold break, because we've looked at this empirically and experimentally and found that beers with more matter in them initially tend to sort of like basically on their way down, they tend to scrub their way down to the bottom of the fermentation vessel, which actually clears it up. Make sure you do a cold crash to drop everything out of it. And you probably already do, but even with a lager, dropping it to near freezing will help pull more out of suspension. And it will leave plenty of yeast behind for bottle conditioning if that's a concern. But gelatin's a fantastic product, and it's dirt cheap and it's easy to use. And yeah, if you used well, you can almost hear the churro hitting the bottom after you pour it in.
So, I use gelatin also, but did I hear you say 2 cycles of gelatin? I've actually never done that before. Explain that.
I did it in a rush once because I had to. I was something we do in my homebrew club. We do duels where you challenge each other to brew a certain kind of beer. And, sometimes we like to, throw a wrench in the other person's works and challenge them to brew like a Pilsner in like 4 weeks. I can't remember what I was brewing, but I knew I had to get it brilliantly clear really fast. And so I did 1 round of gelatin on, day 17 and another on day 18, and that thing dropped as clear as I've ever seen. So, and again, to dilute it by whatever the 1 pint of liquid that I pour in, it was worth it. So, yeah.
Well, that's cool. No, I hadn't heard that, but I like the suggestion. So
again, gelatin's cheap.
Yeah, great question there, Peter. Gary has our next question. I just got 5 pounds of beechwood smoking chips. Why are they so difficult to find?
I have absolutely no idea. It could be a proprietary thing where the breweries don't want people to have them, or they've already got contracts with beechwood providers, and so it's just hard to get in. I don't know if you remember, like 4 or 5 years ago, there was a big story about that AB InBev bought like the entire supply of this one particular hop, and like other brewers couldn't get it. And it's like, well, yeah, but they only brewed in one place, and they just happen to have a contract for almost all of it. It's possible that's true for beechwood. I'll say this: there is nothing magical about beechwood. It's a very versatile, smoked wood. It's useful. You for sure are going to be able to source and find and buy beechwood smoked malt. You're going to be able to find beechwood and smoke and age on it if you want to. But if you can't, there are other options out there, and frankly, they can be great opportunities to experiment with something new.
So I guess what you're saying is just depending on availability, it's more available in some locations or times a year than others.
For sure. And also because like big producers use it in large quantities. So it may not be that you need beechwood. It's just that lots of places already use it, and you may find lots of good options outside of it.
Well, I've had the same question because I wanted to use it for smoking my meats because it seems to provide, the most pleasant smoke that there is?
Well, I would say, try cherrywood smoke, try applewood smoke, try oak smoked. You might find that you enjoy it more.
Great question. Let's go to Edward's question. For a pale Doppelbock, do you use a light Munich malt or other malt for the base?
I would use a light Munich. So, and I think that's, I might cut in some Vienna malt there, but anything in that 3 to 5 Lovibond range. But yeah, and you can augment it. It should really be tuned to, your tasting notes, like brew it once and see how it tastes and come back to it. You may choose something like Belgian aromatic. You might choose something like Melanoidin malt or biscuit malt to sort of bulk up those sort of like low Lovibond flavors, but while making it still very intensely, malty. But yeah.
All right, we are almost done with the questions. So if you've got one, get her in, or otherwise we're going to switch to the Zoom call shortly. Merlinius, and Merlinius and I have judged before. Would a beer brewed under pressure using lager yeast at normal room or ale temperatures still be good in any of these categories in your experience?
Yes. That's an easy one, just because I've seen it done. I've seen breweries that produce pretty large volumes using pressure fermentation for lagers, and for the exact same reason that Miller Lite comes out clean, there's no reason that Rauchbier or Doppelbock wouldn't come out clean as well that I'm aware of. And I've seen it done. I've seen big breweries produce high quality, interesting lagers because the same process works just as well.
Okay, now back into that Miller Lite.
Yes.
How does that fit into that description?
All right, so all of the big production like lager breweries, well, at least I'm assuming. I know Miller Coors does. I can't speak definitively to Budweiser, but like Miller and Coors are produced at relatively warm temperatures, but they ferment under fermentation to keep esters from forming, and as a result, you get these very, very clean, super light adjunct lagers. And so pressure fermentation, that's basically what it does, is it takes freaked out, stressed out yeast and inhibits them from producing the things they would otherwise produce without that pressure on the fermentation.
Okay. I wouldn't have guessed that. All right, our last question. Esteban asks, what's the best way to make an Eisbock?
The best way is to make your very, 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 very best and simplest Doppelbock. That's the first step. And when people ask me for recipe advice on this, that's always my first step, is like start with a really simple, because any little variation, any little tweak you do with other hops or malts or anything else, it's going to be amplified. So you want to start with a very, very clean, simple product to begin with. It's going to get intense enough already. Don't worry about that. Then when you start your freezing cycle to again, get it down to below freezing to get off the ice, start early in the day. I started my first Eisbock at about 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and I was still checking it at 2 or 3 in the morning, assuming that if I put it in a freezer, it would freeze very quickly. It takes a while, okay? And this was only like a 4-gallon batch. So I would say start early-ish in the day. Start by noon on your freeze cycle. And just go down and honestly, don't be a scientist or like a mad scientist about it. Go down every hour or two and give the keg a shake. When you start hearing ice sloshing against the side, give it 3 or 4 more hours, and then rack out from underneath it. And the nice part about it is with what's left. In other words, you can melt down the ice that's left behind in the fermenter or in the keg, and you can do a pretty precise calculation for how much you've concentrated it, and that'll give you a very good clean cut on what the ABV is and everything else. And I'll tell you one thing better, for when people talk about like, do I need to add yeast at bottling? Here is my proof that you definitely don't. I once accidentally, because I fell asleep, over concentrated an Eisbock by about 35 or 40%. I ended up with a monster Eisbock that had been sitting, by the way, in the fermenter for about 3-4 months already, and was like 13%. And that thing bottle conditioned with no additional yeast. Now, it took a little longer. It took it like 2.5-3 weeks instead of a week and a half, but it got the job done. So, yeah, that's my advice.
Okay, it got the job done, but how drinkable was it?
Oh, it was fantastic. In fact, I really hate telling these stories because it sounds like I'm bragging. I swear I'm not. It was so clean. I had to enter it. I entered it as an Eisbock, but the judges came back and said, doesn't seem intense enough for an Eisbock. So I'm like, okay, fine. I'll enter it as a Doppelbock. It's kind of cheating. Entered it in competition as a Doppelbock. Same thing. I ended up having to walk it back to entering it as a Maybach. That's how clean this thing tasted. And I wanted to tell the judges after the fact who thought they were drinking like a 6.3, 6.4% Maybach. I'm like, drink a pint of that. You won't be able to stand up from the table because it was a 13.5% Eisbock. Yeah.
No kidding. And it was that smooth.
Yeah. And that is just something for anyone who enters homebrewing or commercial brewing competitions. For your higher ABV styles, the judges are expecting a certain roughness to it. And if you don't give it to them, they assume it's not there instead of just complimenting you on producing a really, really clean beer. So, yeah, you got to give folks what they're expecting to some degree.
Okay, so we all learned something about judging and entering. So I think that's fantastic. Well, what a great question. Josh, we're actually done with all the questions. And look at you. You're done early. We didn't even hit the end of the meter here.
I promised.
So do you have time for the hangout right quick?
I do. I have at least a little while for sure. Yeah, I'll definitely pop
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody joining. Wow, we had such a big crowd. What, over 1,800? What do we got here? 1,815. Wow.
And thank you to all of you who've been so active in the chat. I've had a real blast reading your comments.
Well, and so for those that are not ready for the party to be quite over, or they haven't finished their beers, and I certainly have not finished mine, we can finish them together or work on them a little bit in the after party. For those that have to go, well, I understand it. We'll look forward to seeing you in our next event. So right now we're going to sign off and we'll move to Zoom. So you see the link there. It says bit.ly, bit.ly/gourmet-hangout. And that's where we'll be next. Thank you. And Edward, yes, I'll see you at HomebrewCon. Bye-bye.